Good evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you. I'm Louis Branscombe, Director of the Science, Technology, and Public Policy Program in the Center for Science and International Affairs of the school. And my very brief but pleasurable duty is to introduce to you the Director of the Center for Science and International Affairs, Ashton Carter, who will be the discussion leader and moderator of tonight's discussion of this interesting subject. It's a great pleasure for us to be very early in this year's schedule in kicking off this program, since the students just began to arrive today. A special welcome to those of you who are new students at the Kennedy School, and a pleasure also to be sharing this Corliss Lamont lecture program with the Institute of Politics and its Forum Office, which provides this wonderful venue for these kinds of discussions. Ashton?
Good, thanks, Lou. And let me begin by thanking Lou Branscombe, the Director of the Science, Technology, and Public Policy Program here at the Kennedy School, for conceiving and organizing this event, and also for conceiving and organizing a workshop that we've collaborated with the Business and Government Center, another center here at the school for new students, on dealing with the topic of tonight's Corliss Lamont lecture. And let me also add my welcome to all of those of you who are new students who have arrived this early in the term. Glad you're here at the Kennedy School. The topic this evening of the Lamont lecture is one that Corliss Lamont, were he here, I think would have approved of. Corliss Lamont, who endowed this lectureship, was someone who believed that the issue of our times, and he began his career of public involvement in the 1950s, was war and peace. And in fact, believe it or not, tonight's topic began with that same question, namely with the relationship between what the Department of Defense does with its huge investments in technology and the competitive performance of U.S. Industry. The very first Corliss Lamont lecture was on that subject. Tonight we're going to extend that dialogue somewhat and ask ourselves, what is the relationship between the federal government's policies and activities that affect industry, in particular high technology industry, or, since high technology industry is a funny phrase in many ways, those industries which depend for their competitive performance on access to and effective utilization of technology. What's the government's role in this inherently, in a capitalist country like the United States, inherently private sector business? What does the public sector have to do with the private sector in those increasing number of sectors of the economy that depend vitally for their competitive performance on technology? Well, the performance of the economy is obviously a hot topic in this election season, and industrial policy and technology policy are an important part of the election dynamic, so this is a very timely topic. Let me just structure it a little bit before I introduce our two speakers. In the first place, let me say that whether the government should be involved in creating the technology base that in important respects, and albeit with other factors, shapes the competitive performance of U.S. industry in world competition, whether the government should be involved in that, that's not really the question. The government is, as a practical matter, deeply involved in the creation of that technology base and in the climate in which technology is used or not used, adopted or not adopted by industry. A little bit of anatomy here. The United States performs, as many of you know, half of all the research and development in the whole world. So this country's kind of half the pie. Of that half the pie, half, that is a quarter, of the world's pie is sponsored by R&D funded by the U.S. federal government. So the U.S. federal government is, by that crude measure, a quarter of the ball game. And it's worth worrying about what that quarter of the ball game contributes to the whole ball game. Now, Most of the political dialogue conceptualizes that relationship between what the government does and what industry does in a formulation that is called spin-off. And the idea is there's the government out doing its thing, appropriate public things like defending the country, worrying about health, worrying about energy and space and all those things that are appropriately the government's business. And in some mysterious fashion, ideas generated through that process of the government doing its own thing show up somehow in industry as well. Industry benefits in some way from that government activity. That's the spin-off model, and I would suggest that that kind of model of mysterious and unplanned relationship is not what we ought to aspire to. What we ought to aspire to is a better understanding and, to the extent we can, shaping of that relationship. So that's one way the government participates, by doing half the R&D that the country does. The other way the government participates, obviously, is through its tax policy, through its antitrust policy, through its macroeconomic policies that affect the climate in which business and innovation is done. And finally, let me say that even though it's a capitalist country and the performance of the economy is essentially supposed to be in the hands of private actors, there are areas of the technology base that are widely agreed to be public responsibilities. And the question of the hour is whether, in addition to those traditionally accepted areas of public responsibility, there are other areas of public responsibility that deserve the name technology policy or industrial policy that are also appropriate. The ones that we're all used to and agree, I think are widely agreed are appropriate, are basic research and education. Now, basic research, everyone says, is a good thing, appropriate thing for government to do, even though basic research is an essential contributor in the long run to the health of technology and therefore to the economy. It's an appropriate thing to do because we all know that when you start out in basic research, you can't really be sure what'll happen, and therefore an individual investor investing in some scientist somewhere can't be sure that he or she will reap the reward of that investment, can't be sure whether that scientist will discover something relevant to this business or that business or to no business. So it's too risky, it's too fuzzy, and we say this is an important thing to do, but no individual investor can reap the benefits, so we'll all invest in it together by pitching in our money through our taxes, having the government do it. Education's the same way. Education's a perfectly good investment, particularly education in science or investment in education in the fields of science and engineering. But it's a public responsibility and not a private responsibility because we don't have slavery. If you had slavery and you could own people from birth to death, then it would be a good investment to invest in their education. It would pay off. We don't have slavery, so we say to ourselves, in order to give people the freedom to move around from job to job, we'll all pitch in and invest in education together. Now, the question that we're going to ask our speakers to address tonight is, are there other things besides basic research and education, things having to do with technology, not science, and things having more directly to do and immediately to do with the competitive performance of industry that are like basic research and like education in that they're appropriate things for the government to invest in, because many will benefit in the long run from those investments, but no private investors have the adequate incentive to invest fully in them. That is, can we get beyond this idea of an unplanned, spontaneous spin-off relationship between what the government does and the performance of the economy into something that deserves the word technology policy, but is truly effective and not subject to abuse and all the other problems that public policies have? That's the question of the hour. As I said, that's a question that has come up in the course of the election campaign, and we have two speakers tonight who are eminently qualified to address this topic. The first of those will be Dexter Baker, who is chairman of the National Association of Manufacturers. The National Association of Manufacturers is the largest national industrial trade group in the United States, accounting for 85% of all U.S. manufacturing output and jobs. And therefore, in that capacity, Mr. Baker is a national spokesperson for U.S. industry. He is also chairman of the board's executive committee at Air Products and Chemicals Incorporated in Allentown in the wonderful state of Pennsylvania. I'm a Philadelphian.
Hello.
He's also a mechanical engineer, which I also approve. Bill Spencer, our second speaker, is a physicist, of which I approve in even greater measure. I, too, am a physicist. He is president and chief executive officer of Sematech Corporation. Sematech is, for those of you who don't know, an example, an experiment, if you like, in technology policy. The Semiconductor Manufacturing Technology Institute is an attempt to get those who manufacture semiconductor technology manufacturing equipment, the stuff that makes the chips that make up all the electronic goodies, together, and together with the federal government as a subsidizer, and to create a better prospect that that industry in the United States survives and is competitive on the international economic sphere. So it's explicitly an occasion for the government to involve itself in such an industry. And one of the arguments, at least, and I'll give you the popular version of why Sematech exists, and Bill can give you the real version. The popular version goes like this, that, geez, chips, everything's it. Chips in your watch, chips in your car, and everything. There's kind of this food chain, and you can't do anything without chips, and you can't have chips unless you have semiconductor manufacturing equipment to make the chips. Therefore, no country is in the world class economically unless it is in this business. Therefore, we have to be in this business, and if we can't do it alone with the private sector, then the government's going to have to help. Therefore, Sematech. That's the popular argument. Therefore, Bill Spencer, an experiment in technology policy. Before taking over this experiment, Bill was senior technical officer at Xerox Corporation, a fully private sector organization, fully successful, and he took over this experiment in October of 1990. That's our issue for the evening. I'll ask our Corliss Lamont lecturers tonight to speak in the order in which I introduced them for maybe 20, 25 minutes each, and then we should have plenty of time for questions from the floor. Dexter Baker, please.
Well, thank you very much, Ashton, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a genuine pleasure to be here. I guess you can hear me all right in that mic. And to close out what I think has been a very productive day, talking about a subject that is very, very important to the private sector. Technology and technology transfer is one of the driving forces in the wealth-creating processes of our nation. I've been asked to share some thoughts with you about technology, economic performance, and particularly the role of our federal government in spurring technological innovation. And I speak to you tonight from the vantage point of having spent 4 decades with one company, Air Products and Chemicals, and in more recent time being directly involved with a range of industries through my responsibilities as chairman of the National Association of Manufacturers. I also had a beginning as a small manufacturer. When I joined Air Products 40 years ago, we had sales of $2.5 million, and we employed 250 people. Today we have sales of over $3 billion. We operate in some 30 different countries on 4 continents, and we did it all out of thin air. I offer 4 observations born out of that long experience in manufacturing. First, the wealth of our nation is created primarily through manufacturing. It's the constant introduction of new products based on new technologies that create wealth. And we do it by reducing costs, reducing the consumption of vital materials. We improve the benefits to the user of those products, and in that process we create wealth for the nation. Our German friends and our Japanese friends understand that, but unfortunately in recent time we seem to have lost track of that vital fact. We became enamored with the service sectors and lost track of what really creates wealth for America. Second, manufacturing is not only increasingly reliant on technology innovations for its success, but it is more than ever a source of those technological innovations. And so public policy directed at advancing technology must simultaneously look first to the health of America's manufacturing sector. Third, we can only solve the social and economic needs of the nation by expanding the size of our economic pie. Redistribution of the existing pie will not improve the economic well-being of the majority of our citizens. And fourth, the widespread myth of America's manufacturing decline is just that. It's a myth. Manufacturing now, as much as ever before, is at the center of America's economic future. It is the principal generator of national wealth, and it is increasingly the measure of our ability to compete successfully around the globe. Let me just elaborate. American manufacturing is undergoing something of a renaissance. We lead the world in productivity, while the rest of the U.S. economy lags badly in that area of economic measurement. Manufacturing productivity growth over the last 10 years in the United States alone has averaged 3% per year. This is nearly 3 times the nation's overall productivity growth rate. Or to say it another way, 21% of our GDP creates all of the productivity growth for the entire nation. Furthermore, American manufacturers have made a tremendous step change in their commitment to quality products. The Malcolm Baldrige Award program is working. It's a good example of where government and the private sector can work effectively together to cause step change in attitudes on the part of a whole industry. There are few companies today who are going to survive who have not embraced the principles of quality production in their manufacturing operations. As a result, American manufacturers' exports have doubled in the last 5 years. And in that same 5-year time frame, we have moved from a trade deficit of $20 billion a year with Western Europe to a trade surplus of $20 billion a year with Europe. Except for our automotive trade with Japan and our electronic consumer product trade with Japan, America has achieved essentially a positive trade balance in manufactured goods with the rest of the world. Now, what should government do to encourage technological innovations so that we can continue to modernize our industrial capacity, so we can win in the marketplace what we have secured through our victory in the Cold War? Simply put, the answer is that the U.S. government should put aside its fear of moving beyond the support of basic science and also embrace engineering and technology. While I agree with these words, they're not my words. Lou Branscombe and Ashton Carter will recognize them as taken directly from Beyond Spinoff, which Lou and Ashton co-authored. A little background may provide some perspective on why it is time for the government to move beyond the support of purely scientific and into the business of technology and technology transfer. American manufacturers of every size and sector face markets that are increasingly international and competitive. It is no mystery that a few factors in successful meeting this challenge is the effective deployment and use of technological resources. What is still a mystery is that after years of debate and exhaustive studies, we still are far from a national consensus. And you should have heard the discussion this afternoon. There was no real consensus on what role government should properly play in this new competitive environment that U.S. industry now finds itself in. In recent years, several domestic industry sectors have been wounded by increased global competition. In part, this can be attributed to actions by foreign nations to target specific industries for development through their trade policy or their direct financial aid policy, or through subsidizing technology developments. The result is inevitable. Foreign companies gain market share at the expense of unsubsidized or unfocused U.S.-based enterprises. And over time, inevitably, market leadership will follow technology leadership, which then leads to global market leadership. In spite of the impressive performances by some individual industries, and mine, the chemical industry, happens to be one of the positive ones. We enjoyed a $20 billion surplus with the rest of the world in trade in chemical products. Our U.S. government's response to this competitive challenge has been somewhat less than proactive. Our manufacturers' problems are multidimensional, involving increased payroll costs, increased healthcare costs, a bubonic plague of litigation expenses, excessive and unnecessary regulatory compliance burdens, questionable social mandates that are imposed upon our manufacturing industries, and worker educational skill deficits. We must not deceive ourselves that we can solve these misdirected public policy initiatives, which are so hurtful to the wealth-creating processes of our nation, by an enlightened technology development policy alone. No matter how well conceived or executed, no government new technology policy framework is powerful enough to overcome the negative drag of an anti-competitive initiatives taken by other sectors of our government. Technological policy directions are important to American manufacturers and to our nation's wealth-creating capacity. But it's only part of the solution. We must never make the mistake of substituting one pinch of sugar for all that vinegar that's poured into our competitive cocktail. Our whole national policy agenda must be comprehensively pro-competitive, not just one-dimensional pro-technology initiatives. To emphasize my point, let me cite two illustrations of fundamental problems affecting U.S. products: legal costs and regulatory costs. In the aggregate, these excess costs drain hundreds of billions from our national R&D, our capital investments, and our worker skills and development programs. American industry spent $75.8 billion in outside legal services in 1987 alone, and this excludes the in-house costs of maintaining their own legal departments. This cost doubled since 1982, and the forecasts are that it will probably have doubled since 1987 to 1992. NAM now estimates that these legal costs are running American industry between $120 and $150 billion a year. Just last week, the U.S. Senate failed to enact meaningful tort reform after more than 10 years of efforts. Our legal system is a burden on American industry, and it's no wonder that so many companies are moving abroad. Compare this bill, almost $150 billion, if you will, with our entire commercial R&D budget last year of $75 billion. We are paying nearly twice as much for litigation expense as we are for creating new wealth in this country. This is a recipe for long-term economic disaster. While regulations affect all industries, the lion's share of regulatory costs faced by manufacturers are environmental. In 1990, industry spent $51.6 billion on pollution abatement. Independent studies indicate that the cost will rise to $75 billion this year and will top more than $100 billion by the time that the Clean Air Act is fully implemented. A truly extraordinary fact emerges. The aggregate of U.S. manufacturing federal regulatory expenses exceeds the aggregate of their pre-tax profits. I submit that controlling the growth of legal expenses and regulatory burdens will do more for my company and my country and the bottom line performance than any other set of government policy initiatives. Or to put it the other way around, without reform, the positive effects of a sound national technology policy will be canceled out by the continuing adverse effects of unreformed legal and regulatory burdens. Product liability costs in this country cost 10 times as much as in Europe and Japan. If we do not create a pro-growth, pro-competitive set of national policies, including technology policy, we will not be able to compete in the world as a whole, and in short, we will lose. And keep in mind that 2/3 of the world's markets for manufactured products lie outside the borders of the United States. Our discussion today and this evening's forum are devoted to the creation of a sound national technology policy initiative, and I do have some suggestions for improving it. I believe that we can all agree today that it's not the United States government role to direct industrial development or to employ what has become a very tiresome phrase, the government should not pick winners or avoid losers. However, NAM does believe it is important for government to facilitate technology innovation and national strategic thinking. That is a role that government can play. Now, what does this mean in practice? What are the specifics of such a government role? Let me try to answer that on 3 levels: policy changes, organizational changes, and federal program focus. Now, it's true that if you tax something more, you get less of it. If you tax it less, you probably will get more of it. And tax policy can be a powerful incentive for innovation and technology development. Unfortunately, Congress too often considers tax policy more in terms of its ability to leverage political support than for the power to leverage innovation, research, competitiveness, and wealth creation in America. Why else the persistent practice of temporary extensions of R&D tax credits rather than making the R&D tax credit a permanent feature of our tax code upon which business planners can count and plan upon? Research is an investment in our future, just as surely as capital investments or as is worker training. Antitrust policy is another non-technology policy issue that begs for a more modern approach. A century after the enactment of the Sherman Antitrust Act, we still measure relevant market share for U.S. manufacturers based upon domestic share only. Our antitrust approach needs to recognize that American enterprise must compete in the global marketplace. We need to move ahead with legislation that would expand the 1984 National Cooperation Research Act to encourage production and research joint ventures. Our competitors in Europe recognize worldwide market share in European mergers. Why shouldn't we do that here in the United States? Additionally, other issues often not included on the rubric of technology policy should not be ignored. Surely export controls, which need to be relaxed now that the Cold War is over, and the treatment of foreign investment are among these. Most assuredly, worker skills fit in as well. An NAM survey that we just finished says that the biggest obstacles to the introduction of new technology in manufacturers' operation is the inability of the workers to master that technology. Surely improved education training is a fundamental item on any pro-technology, pro-competitive policy agenda. Before leaving the policy level, I offer a more general observation. We need to step back from the mutual distrust and downright hostility that plague the private sector's relationship with government. We need to create the same cooperative spirit that exists between industrial sector and the research establishments at many of our nation's leading universities. And that didn't always have a positive relationship either. Campus after campus has industrial consortiums which focus on advancing technology in individual areas of industrial interest. At Lehigh University, where I happen to be one of the board of trustees, we have 13 such industrial consortiums ranging from polymer emulsion institutes, the design of high-rise steel structures, to semiconductor devices, to biotechnology processes. And they're all institutes in which the private sector and the university are cooperating and exchanging ideas, experiments, and driving the R&D programs. Our international competitors are using public-private partnerships to their advantage, while we are still each other's throats to our disadvantage. It's time to cooperate. We all ride in the same economic boat. As public policy must adapt in the face of worldwide change, so must our organizational frameworks. Institutions that worked one way in the past may not work that way now, or may not even work at all. This is true both for the private sector as well as the public sector. The story of the 1980s on the private sector side has been a story of restructuring, of slimming and trimming and delayering. And so I'll concentrate my remarks on the government side. The most obvious and important example of the need for organizational change is our federal laboratory system of more than 700 separate facilities. Because many of the problems these labs were designed to solve were defense-related, money was virtually no object, and cost effectiveness was a decidedly secondary concern. And I'm not going to argue with that. I think that was probably right when we were facing the threat of a worldwide confrontation with communism. As we now know, though, that the justification for the federal laboratory system is now increasingly challenged. The question we must ask ourselves is, how does America get an adequate return on the $22 billion that we spend in our federal laboratories each year? I can tell you that some of my members and some of my colleagues and some of my board of directors would give you a quick answer. Don't even try. Shut down the labs. They're not only competitors for scarce resources, but unfair competitors at that. Well, I would not go that far. It is not unreasonable to expect that the federal lab system adapt itself to the new environment in which our nation finds itself. For example, could the savings realized from a more commercially focused, streamlined federal laboratory system make up for the revenue shortfall that stands in the way of a permanent R&D tax credit? A 10% reduction in our federal laboratory costs alone would expand the private sector research by more than 5%. In this vein, I propose that we establish a federal laboratory closing commission, similar to the National Military Base Closing Commission. Not only does this mechanism work, it may well be the only objective and politically feasible way of refocusing the federal laboratory system. To be more politic, we can call it the Federal Lab Evaluations Commission. The results, however, should be the same: to streamline the entire system and to close those facilities that are in direct and unnecessary competition with the private sector, or whose missions are no longer relevant to the broader U.S. national interest. Industry does this every year. Why shouldn't the federal government? When missions change, organizations must change. Private sector has adapted to a changing world environment. So must the public sector. This may sound harsh, but we simply cannot afford to do otherwise. It simply must be done. At the same time, we need to reassess our national R&D priorities in order to achieve more commercial bang for the $75 billion in 1992 that the federal government spends on research. At the federal level, we do not need to spend more on R&D, but we must spend each dollar wisely and with better focus. I suggest that the one way to do this is to involve industry more closely in federal R&D agenda setting and planning and review process. The general atmosphere of mistrust that divides government and industry will not be a simple matter to overcome. But national trade policy and agricultural policy, as formulated in this way, and I suggest that national scientific and technology policies can benefit from greater cooperation and involvement of the private sector. Complicating the situation is the need for changes in federal agency missions, lab management practices, and of course, employee attitudes. There are some indications, however, that these changes are beginning to happen, which leads me to the program level. One of the most significant developments related to federal R&D spending over the past few years has been the emergence of the budget crosscut. Essentially, these budget crosscuts take stock of the various, usually disparate R&D activities across all relevant federal agencies in a given subject area. Then the pieces are put back together in a more coherent, focused way on a particular subject matter. The result is an overall federal R&D effort that is more focused and, I suggest, more effective. Global climate change was the first crosscut. That was done in 1991, followed by math and science education, then high-performance computing and networking, and now biotechnology and materials. Last March, the Bush administration announced that advanced manufacturing would be the focus of its 1994 crosscut. Notably, the White House has stressed for the first time the need for close industry involvement in the manufacturing crosscut. Although industry's experience in the high-performance computing and materials crosscuts was a little bit shaky, we at NAM have nevertheless accepted the administration's challenge to become involved in the high-performance manufacturing assessment of our national laboratories' research and development activities. Under NAM's leadership, the private sector organized itself and produced a broad-based response to the administration's proposed 1994 Advanced Manufacturing Initiative, and we did it in 4 weeks. This private sector critique, which makes both technology and procedural recommendations, will help guide the federal R&D effort towards those areas most likely to benefit the overall economy. A lot of work lies ahead, but we've made a start. In the closing of Beyond Spinoff, the authors state leaders in industry should call for government support of those portions of the knowledge base that generate widespread benefit but do not already draw large private investment. And I agree with that, and NAM agrees with that. And we call for that support here and now. But always recognize this is but one factor in our overall economic growth. Competition among nations has always taken many forms. Those social, political, economic systems that adapt the best have the prospects of surviving, even of growing. From a pre-World War II near indifference by the federal government to science and research, except in the case of agriculture, which was started back in the 1860s in Lincoln's time, we have moved to accept that there was indeed a legitimate and positive federal role in stimulating scientific education and advancement. The result has been nearly a half-century of strong government support for science research and scientific experimentation, which resulted in global scientific leadership. No wonder we continue to win the most Nobel Prizes for new scientific achievements. Now, because of increasing global and techno-economic competition, it's time to do the same thing with our technology base. We do not need massive new government-driven initiatives or technology of the week programs. Rather, in light of international economic and competitive realities, we need new alternative techniques to encourage technological leadership in both defense and non-defense areas. Let's experiment, and we're going to hear about that in a minute from Bill. But for our future's sake, let's cooperate. Let's insist upon cooperation between industry and academia and government as a condition of further federal government spending. The authors of Beyond Spinoff conclude with these words: new policies are needed for a world where the United States holds no technological monopoly, and the nation should get on with the job of creating them. and I couldn't agree more. In doing so, however, let us make certain that we remind ourselves that the best technology policy in the world cannot thrive in an otherwise anti-business, anti-growth economic environment. We need to focus on creating our own national wealth. Let's stop depending upon borrowing the fruits of other nations' wealth-creating processes. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill Spencer is our next speaker. Dexter will be giving the welcoming lectures at the law school later in the week.
Absolutely. With pleasure.
Good evening. I know these older students here are getting rather tired from their all-day session here, so I'll try and keep these remarks short. I want to thank you, Lou and Ash, for inviting me up to this stimulating and open discussion we've had all day. It also gave my wife, who's joined me for the weekend here, an opportunity for us to see a late summer weekend down Maine and up in New Hampshire. Now, don't explain to me how we did those two things simultaneously. I read the letter that you sent me to this and asked that we keep the discussion focused on science and technology as they relate to economic performance, rather than on trade, fiscal, and monetary policy, as important as they are. Now, being a physicist, I was uncertain that I knew the difference between economic, fiscal, monetary policies, and so I scratched around, and I found in the New York Times, which is not a physics journal, by the way, a comment by a leading economist. This economist, this well-known economist, Michael Crichton, said, "A decade ago, this country was a leader in every major technological area and had the world's highest gross national product per capita. Today, we've lost the lead in most technologies and are falling behind in the rest. In no area have we gained ground. We now rank 5th in GNP per capita. Real wages have slipped to 1960 levels, and our national debt has tripled, creating a burden that threatens our economic recovery and will truly be a burden for my children and grandchildren." Now, I want to move from that big, large economic picture, I assume it's economic and not fiscal nor monetary, down to a small and focused experiment. Two areas where the United States has certainly lost market leadership in the last 2 decades has been in electronics and semiconductors. 1975, the United States had 70% of the worldwide semiconductor market. By 1985, that had dropped below 50%, and we were surpassed for the first time ever in the history of that industry by competition from Japan. That market decline continued until 1989. The United States currently holds about 37% of the market, and the Japanese about 50%. And indications are that with the loss of that market, the United States will also lose market leadership in computers and in communications during this decade of the 1990s. Now, the reason market share leadership in those technologies is so important is because of the rapid growth during the last 2 decades and the projected continued growth over the next 2 decades. In 1990, the world market for semiconductor devices was about $60 billion. For electronics, at that same time frame, it was $750 billion. Both of those markets will grow during the decade, semiconductors to just over $200 billion by the end of this decade, and electronics to just over $2 trillion by the end of this decade. Now, during the time that the U.S. lost leadership in the semiconductor market, the Japanese generated 125,000 new jobs. This same Japanese report projected a growth rate for the semiconductor industry of 15% per year for the remainder of this decade. 15% per year. 10% of this growth is in new job creation, and 5% of that growth is in improved productivity. There are all kinds of reasons given why the United States lost leadership in the semiconductor market. There were charges of dumping in the United States. There was charges of of non-level playing fields, of lower cost of capital. But I think one point stands out very clearly. These other things I believe are true. But one thing stands out very clearly, and that is we did not manufacture semiconductor devices at the beginning of the 1980s as effectively as our competition did. We did not manufacture as effectively as our competition did. 1987, the Semiconductor Industry Association, a much smaller group than the National Association of Manufacturers, decided we had to do something about that problem. Now, fortunately, at about the same time, the Defense Department decided they needed to do something about that as well. Before I describe that experiment, let me spend just a minute on manufacturing. I agree with Dexter. It is the key issue that we face in the nation today. There are a lot of schools of thought about how important manufacturing is or isn't. One of those schools of thought said that we should provide an attractive environment for jobs in the United States and not worry about who has the ownership of those jobs. And I certainly agree with that conclusion. It was a conclusion the National Academy of Engineering came to in a study that I was privileged to be a part of. However, I believe that if we don't generate or don't attempt to generate those jobs through U.S. firms, it'll ultimately put us in a job competition with people from Singapore, India, Russia, a couple of the other republics of the old USSR, and ultimately the PRC. They have highly trained, highly educated workforce, and it's not a competition I think we want to get in for jobs. There's also an argument that the U.S. should focus on its systems capability and not get involved in manufacturing. Now, obviously, every company has to look at appropriate trade-off of systems, software versus hardware in its manufacturing. There was a point made by the Japanese in a manufacturing study that they did called 21st Century Manufacturing Report. It said the concept that a post-industrial society can be exclusively an information society while being utterly dependent on material production from elsewhere is overly simplistic. That's our competition's point of view, and I believe it's a key one. Growing up in the Midwest, I had an opportunity to see the difference between farms that were owned by the farmer and ones that were owned by a sharecropper. There's a big difference, and I don't think we want to get in that situation in this country. Now, these are only a few of the diverging ideas about manufacturing, whether it's important. I believe that these areas are so complex and overlie so many disciplines: economics, monetary policy, trade policy, technology, and education, and that there's no underlying theory, as far as I know, that predicts whether having a manufacturing capability is important or not, and whether having a focus just on systems is important or not, that the only way we can resolve those issues are through a series of national experiments. Now, Sematech was such an experiment. It's a focused, long-term experiment in government, industry, university collaboration. 1988 was a key year for Sematech. An Austin site was chosen for Sematech. Bob Noyce, who'd been a leader in the semiconductor industry, became the first CEO. The building and fabrication facilities were dedicated in November. And in 1989, the spring of that year, first silicon was produced from that facility, and Sematech signed its first joint development contract with the U.S. semiconductor equipment suppliers. Now, Ash, one thing I want to correct is that if it's done in Europe, we call it subsidization. If it's done in the United States, we call it cooperation. This cooperation was established to improve U.S. manufacturing capability in semiconductor devices. And a major focus of that effort was to renew the U.S. equipment industry. Today, pieces of equipment to manufacture semiconductor devices cost a couple of $1 million. By the time you install it, it costs another $500,000, and by the time you qualify that piece of equipment, you sometimes spent 2 or 3 times the investment up to that point. If we could come up with a single way of qualifying equipment, we could save the industry a tremendous amount of money, and that's been the focus for Sematech during its first 3 or 4 years. Now, it's important to understand some of the things that Sematech is not. We do not design dynamic random access memories, nor microprocessors, nor any other semiconductor product. In fact, we don't even design processes to manufacture those specific products. That's a misconception that's been about for Semitech for a long time. We believe that's an area where our member companies can compete, and we focus on generic manufacturing technology. Today, Semitech's about 700 people, predominantly in Austin, Texas, spending about $200 million a year, 50% of which comes from the federal government, and 60% of our budget of that $200 million, about $120 million, is spent in the equipment industry outside of Austin. Now, rather than give you my version of Semitech's accomplishments, I want to read you a quote that came from the GAO. I had a discussion with Harvey Brooks today for a little while about the GAO. I happen to believe they're designed to find things that are wrong. Harvey tells me they're much more benevolent than that. But anyway, they made this report to Congress as Semitech has demonstrated that a government industry R&D consortia on manufacturing technology can help to restore U.S. industry's competitive position while protecting the government's interest that the consortia be managed well and public funds spent appropriately. We couldn't have asked for a better review at GAO, from GAO. In addition to that, VLSI Research, which is a independent group that monitors the U.S. equipment industry, said that in 1991, after more than a decade of decline, there had been a turnaround in the equipment industry. And they said it's clear that there is an American comeback. We believe this is a prima facie evidence of the beneficial effect that Semitech has had and the consequential improvement in American equipment. Americans now seem more willing to buy American equipment. Now, we think all of our supporters and a number of our critics have considered Semitech successful. So what do we do next? Sometime over the next 12 months, Semitech will spend its billionth dollar. By the time we've spent that dollar, I think Semitech will have met all the goals it set in 1988 by the first CEO and the board of directors. 1993 is going to be a year of change for us. Semitech's going to continue to develop the best equipment in the world, but we're going to focus now more on the integration of that equipment into manufacturing systems. We believe the United States has a clear leadership position in network systems, in system software, in most of the application software that are used today. We're going to apply that leadership in the U.S. to manufacturing issues in semiconductor devices. We think it's a place where the United States can move from parity, where we believe we are today, into leadership in the future. Now, there are a number of lessons that we learned from Semitech, and I want to go over these very quickly and be sure there's time for questions. I believe a key part of getting Semitech started was that it was industry-led. It was an industry idea. The directions for Semitech have been set by industry, and it's been managed by industry people. I believe it was equally important that we have joint government-industry funding. There are a number of reasons for that. The main one I'll give this evening is that our competition is all working in a cooperative mode. Europe today is investing more from government sources than any other economic region, and the Japanese have taught us how to cooperate in that mode better than anyone else. I believe it's important for a consortia like this to represent the entire industry. The membership in Semitech today is more than 80% of the semiconductor industry in the United States. I believe it's important for us to use member company personnel. One of the best ways to transfer technology developed in Semitech or any other consortia back to the member companies or to wherever you want it to go is through the participants in that consortia. 2/3 of the engineers today and an equal number of the managers at Semitech are there for 2 or 3 years and then will return to their member companies at the end of that period. You absolutely need champions. Had Bob Noyce not stepped forward and run Semitech early on, had Charlie Spork not been one of the organizers, both of whom were pioneers in this area, Semitech wouldn't have the credibility it has today. We've also been fortunate in that we've had a series of champions in Washington. Some of them were here today. They've been bipartisan, and they've been in both the administration and in Congress. I think it's essential that there be a clear mission. Sematech has that mission today in creating fundamental change in semiconductor manufacturing. I think it's important to think about long-term support. Problems in manufacturing technology are not short-term. We didn't lose manufacturing leadership in 1985. We lost it because of things we started doing back in 1965. And I believe it will take us a decade or longer to regain that leadership. This industry moves so quickly that there's no place where we can find a resting point. We can't stop. The competition that we have will quickly pass us. I think it's important that we have measurable success criteria. Sematech chose a specific set of goals. We tried to turn around the equipment industry, and I think in each of those we succeeded. I think it's important to have things that we can measure and determine whether we met those objectives or not. And finally, I want to build on a point that Dexter made earlier, and that is we have to develop a total quality process. I think the Department of Commerce has done an outstanding job in developing the Malcolm Baldrige criteria as a total quality management process for American industry. It's had a major impact on the company that I was in before coming to Sematech, and it's been one of the key things that we have accomplished at Sematech. Retaining and strengthening manufacturing in high-tech industries is essential for the well-being of the United States. Without ownership of these manufacturing jobs, the U.S. standard of living will continue to decline, and the U.S. stands a chance of becoming a second-rate nation as we move into the post-industrial age. Uniquely American ways need to be developed to determine how the U.S. will maintain that manufacturing leadership. Over the past 3 or 4 years, the semiconductor industry has been involved in such an experiment with the U.S. government and with U.S. universities. The experiment is long-term and is focused on developing semiconductor manufacturing leadership. There are other major issues facing the semiconductor industry in addition to high-quality manufacturing, and our success alone will not lead to success of the U.S. industry. But I believe by establishing U.S. leadership in semiconductor manufacturing, we can provide the basis for market leadership as the nation faces its equally difficult issues in finance, trade, education, and economics, even if I don't know what they are. Thank you.
Okay, we have some time for some questions, and let me ask our host, Lou Branscombe, please, for the first question.
Okay. Bill, you said that Sematech was supported in part by 50% by the government. I believe that support comes from the Department of Defense. And you made the statement that the Defense Science Board had studied the defense dependency on semiconductors and concluded that was a vital national security issue. But the case you made for Sematech and its value and its contribution to the society is really not a case based on defense. It's a case based on the vitality of the economy as a whole. And I guess my question is, if Sematech were not supported by defense, do you believe that it is justified that some other part of the government should have supported it? And if so, what part of the government should have supported it, or should be now supporting it, other than defense?
What we need to know is there anybody here from defense? I've heard this described in the following way, Lou. I've been asked that question once or twice before, and the original Willie Horton, not the one that was in the 1988 elections, was asked, why does he rob banks? And the answer, of course, was that's where the money is. Now, in some sense, the only organization in the federal government today with funds where they can run an experiment like this is the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense also has in place a superb organization in the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. They have managed high-tech projects for 30 years. Harvey could tell us how long, and they have been responsible for the U.S. 30 years. They have been responsible for the U.S. preeminence in materials, the material science research centers that were set up in the late 50s and early 60s, for the leadership we have in the computer science area today, and I think they can play a leadership role in manufacturing as well. So whether the money came from defense or commerce, which would seem a more likely home, I think the problem of manufacturing is important. It lays over the institutions of commerce, defense. Defense has certainly got to have flexible manufacturing to meet its needs over the next decade. And I believe we could work within the semiconductor industry with any of those organizations. I think it is important for the government to remain involved.
Good. This gentleman's next. Let me ask those who have questions to use one of the two microphones on the side, and that includes folks that are up there in the upper levels whom I can't see, blinded here, but come on down to the microphone if you have questions. Yes, sir. And would you say to whom the question is?
Mr. Baker noted that we all ride in the same economic boat, but the manufacturers are doing all the rowing, and there are a great many free riders, such as lawyers, regulators, non-producing consumers, and so on.
Educators.
Some of them, I think, could be considered useful, as opposed to lawyers who are literally anti-productive. I mean, they...
Okay, we have some time for some questions, and let me ask our host, Lou Branscombe, please, for the first question.
Okay. Bill, you said that Sematech was supported in part by 50% by the government. I believe that support comes from the Department of Defense. And you made the statement that the Defense Science Board had studied the defense dependency on semiconductors and concluded that was a vital national security issue. But the case you made for Sematech and its value and its contribution to the society is really not a case based on defense. It's a case based on the vitality of the economy as a whole. And I guess my question is, if Sematech were not supported by defense, do you believe that it is justified that some other part of the government should have supported it? And if so, what part of the government should have supported it, or should be now supporting it, other than defense?
What we need to know is there anybody here from defense? I've heard this described in the following way, Lou. I've been asked that question once or twice before, and the original Willie Horton, not the one that was in the 1988 elections, was asked, why does he rob banks? And the answer, of course, was that's where the money is. Now, in some sense, the only organization in the federal government today with funds where they can run an experiment like this is the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense also has in place a superb organization in the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. They have managed high-tech projects for 30 years. Harvey could tell us how long, and they have been responsible for the U.S. 30 years. They have been responsible for the U.S. preeminence in materials, the material science research centers that were set up in the late 50s and early 60s, for the leadership we have in the computer science area today, and I think they can play a leadership role in manufacturing as well. So whether the money came from defense or commerce, which would seem a more likely home, I think the problem of manufacturing is important. It lays over the institutions of commerce, defense. Defense has certainly got to have flexible manufacturing to meet its needs over the next decade. And I believe we could work within the semiconductor industry with any of those organizations. I think it is important for the government to remain involved.
Good. This gentleman's next. Let me ask those who have questions to use one of the two microphones on the side, and that includes folks that are up there in the upper levels whom I can't see, blinded here, but come on down to the microphone if you have questions. Yes, sir. And would you say to whom the question is?
Mr. Baker noted that we all ride in the same economic boat, but the manufacturers are doing all the rowing, and there are a great many free riders, such as lawyers, regulators, non-producing consumers, and so on.
Educators.
Some of them, I think, could be considered useful, as opposed to lawyers who are literally anti-productive. I mean, they can make a claim on the output of those with whom they interfere by establishing irrational regulation, for example, as opposed to an educator who presumably doesn't teach lies. But anyway, I expect that the non-producing consumers are not about to willingly give up their entitlements. They seem to be quite prosperous, and they're not likely to go to work in direct manufacturing. It seems to me that our government has created this situation. Is there any reason to believe that without increasing the number of direct production workers or reducing the non-productive overhead, the burden of non-productive overhead, that we can in fact be effectively competitive in the world?
I think that there is an education job that has to be done, and I was being facetious about educators because I think that we do have to communicate to all of our population how wealth is created in America, and we truly have lost sight of that. And one of the things that public policy does in Japan and Germany is that they understand how important nationally manufacturing is, and they have organized their industry, their government, their public sector, and their private sector to reflect on that. And so we have to start with that fundamental understanding. And one of the things that NAM is doing now is we're going out and producing papers. We have a brochure out that we have circulated to 2,000 opinion leaders in Washington and elsewhere on really what manufacturing does, what our progress has been, and why we are deserving of public support. We've made some progress. I commented about that product liability because it was a recent defeat in the Senate, which was disappointing. But we got within 2 votes of cloture. We had 58 votes. We needed 60. We had a majority of the senators committed to pass a modest product liability reform legislation, but we couldn't get the 60 to cut off debate. So we've made progress. It's going to come up again. Next time we'll get 2 more votes because we know who voted against it.
But don't you feel it's about 20 years too late?
Yeah, well, I agree that. I mean, you know, clearly we shouldn't have to be doing this, but the fact is that all of us got enamored with the concept that we were going to become a service-dominated society, and we forgot about the wealth creation component that's needed to foster a more convenient lifestyle.
Thanks. David, are you waiting for that's great. Nick. Sorry, go ahead and stand right up.
I have a question about the precise nature of cooperation that we're really looking for. It's directed to both of our speakers. I probably should confess right away that I'm a political scientist, so underneath underneath cooperative outcomes, I tend to see either a lot of bribery, which we more politely call side payments, or a lot of arm twisting, which is simply not visible on the surface. And in the cases of Germany and Japan, this is really the part of the question for Mr. Baker. I do think it's important to remember that the cooperative business-government relations do involve many constraints placed on business leaders. They're very complex negotiating procedures in both of those countries. I don't think many U.S. industrialists would want to deal with the European community, for instance, probably the bureaucracy that produces more regulation than any in the world. And the question is, in this effort toward a more cooperative relationship with government, which I agree is very necessary in this country, is American business prepared to engage in a more detailed and structured process of negotiation with organized labor, perhaps with parts of the judicial system. That's really part one. Could I go on and just ask the more detailed part of the cooperation question for Mr. Spencer? Could you tell us a little bit more about the precise kinds of cooperation that happen among Sematech Consortium members? Because I think it is, again, different than what happens either in Europe or in Japan, where at least in the early days of the VLSI program or in some of the JESSE programs, again, the political authorities really engaged in some arm twisting, telling the industrial partners that they had to share know-how and probably at the margins a little bit more than they wanted. And I would just be interested to see how in an experiment which is an extremely interesting one and a somewhat different one, how that mechanism works out.
Okay, so first question to Mr. Baker and second Mr. Spencer.
Well, on the generic question, is industry prepared to cooperate? I think that you have seen in recent times some pretty good role models that can be built upon. Clearly, I think Sematech is a very specific model that bears a lot of support. But let's take some other examples. The National Baldrige Award Program was established by the federal government, but what is not generally known is it completely financed by the private sector. And I happen to be a trustee of that program. The National Bureau of Standards had designated one of their senior members, Kurt Ryman, who's done just an absolutely fantastic job of recruiting individuals from government and the private sector to be evaluators, to set up the program. There is a joint board between the government and the private sector, the Baldrige Trust Board, and through a completely objective evaluation system, they have gone out and appraised industry and have developed good case stories of what industries are doing, and then they're disseminating that information to all industry. And then they finally pick those industries who really exemplify the really best as role models. And then they encourage those selected winners to go out and preach to all other industry sectors. And so there has been a really mindset shift from a very little bit of money, but has had a tremendous impact on the way industry does business. Now, it's a survival issue, because if you don't change, if you don't make producing quality goods as your number one strategic objective, you're not likely to be there next year. So that people finally did get the message that the consumer was no longer prepared to accept anything less than a perfect product. And so that's a good example. Another example is our national trade policy. The USTR, who is established by Congress as the principal agency to conduct international trade negotiations on behalf of America, including American industry, is only staffed with 200 professional people. They're a very lean, and some say mean organization. But they have 40 separate private sector committees with some 1,500 representatives from the private sector. And so when we negotiate in Brussels, when we negotiate in Montreal, or when we negotiate in Tokyo or Mexico City, as we've done recently, the USTR has at their backside a representative from every industrial sector. Not only that, but those sectors are obligated by law to report directly to the Congress and to the administration on whether they believe what USTR is proposing for America is a good public policy. And so, as a result of the Mexican free trade negotiation just completed by USTR, 40 separate reports by individual industry sectors and a number of generic sectors. I happen to be on the one on investment, but there's one on financial services, there's one on intellectual property rights, another one on agriculture and automobiles and so forth and so Those reports will go to Congress and to the administration, and they'll point out the pluses and minuses of each of the deals that have been cut there, and give their input in that way. I think you could do the same thing with technology policy. Now, the other example, and then I'll shut up and let Bill talk, is that for a long time there was a rather aloof, distant relationship between industry and academia in connection with industrial research, or research generally that had application industry. The academic side said we have to publish, we can't be constrained, we can't give preferential rights to industry, we can't hold up scientific knowledge that might be of value to the country as a whole. But increasingly, we have come together because the private sector recognizes that in our university laboratories, we really have some outstanding people and some outstanding capability. And it behooves us to tap into that. And so we have developed models, industrial consortiums on various campuses dealing with different technology areas. And with some funding from the national science centers, plus funding from some of the defense establishments and the private sector again, we have drawn much closer together. And I think we in this country are enriched by that relationship that has developed over recent time frames, and it's really been in the last 10 years. And the thing that drove it was that the federal government ran out of money, and so the universities went to industry and said, could you help out? And out of that need became a cooperative spirit. So there are models out there that I think can be used as examples, and I think you always have to look for positive, successful models if you're trying to introduce, a new genetic process someplace else. Bill?
Let me comment first on the cooperation in Europe. When I left Xerox almost 2 years ago, we were working very hard to become a fully qualified European supplier with all of the things necessary to do that in the European community. While I was there, we built a research center in Cambridge. I believe that's since been expanded to have a branch in Paris. Sorry I missed out on that. I know that's true of IBM and DEC, Intel, Hewlett-Packard, Motorola as well. So American companies do understand, I think, what it takes to cooperate on an international basis. Let me give you just one example from Semitech, because I could spend the rest of the evening talking about the things we do to cooperate. Intel and AMD, Advanced Micro Devices, are involved in a very bitter dispute over who owns the rights to the architecture, the microcode, and software of the N86 processors. They're in a expensive court fight. Their management says bad things about one another in the paper. There are 70 of their engineers who are at Austin working on products to build the 586 and the 686 microprocessors together. They're on teams. Some of that equipment is being proved in Intel's facility in Santa Clara, some in AMD's facility in Austin. I don't think you could have a better example of cooperation than even though you've got a bitter legal battle going on.
This gentleman here.
Mr. Spencer, I was wondering if you could comment on Semitech's future now that U.S. industry has been signing these joint production and research agreements with the Japanese and Germans.
You're not allowed to read the Wall Street Journal if you come to these. We've had a ongoing battle with the Wall Street Journal for the past 3 weeks over that issue. Dan McCurdy gave an absolutely wonderful talk this afternoon in IBM's position on this. I believe that the IBM, Toshiba, Siemens cooperation is aimed at a specific product. I believe the AMD Fujitsu one is aimed at a specific product. NEC, AT&T, Hitachi, TI, all of those are aimed at specific product developments because they're expensive. They need to share the risk and cost of developing that particular product. Now, I believe they were also looking at ways to crack markets. Dan says that's not true, that IBM looks at trade policy in a different way. Dan knows a lot more about that than I do, so half of my argument is gone. Semitech, on the other hand, is focused on how to manufacture those products. We don't care whether it's a flash memory or a 256 meg DRAM or a microprocessor or a RISC chip or what it is. We want to ensure that American companies, U.S.-based companies, and we can identify those pretty easily, I think, have the ability to manufacture in the United States, create those manufacturing jobs here, better than anybody else in the world. We think the two things are complementary. In fact, Jack Keeler at IBM, Ian Ross at AT&T said those joint ventures mean it's more necessary than ever to have Sematech if we're going to have the manufacturing here in the future rather than in Japan.
And then, Mr. Baker, I worked at the Department of Commerce a few months ago, and though I was never involved with the Malcolm Baldrige Award, I was somewhat, I guess, mystified when General Motors won the award. If you could maybe explain that.
Well, I think that the Cadillac division of General Motors, and there's representatives here that can speak better than I, has shown a dramatic improvement in their commitment to quality, and I think the product reflects that. I happen to have two Cadillac cars. One is a 1988 vintage, and one I just recently bought, and I can tell you there's a world of difference in the models that are being delivered today versus the one that I bought several years ago. The finish, the performance, the quietness, the response of the engine, the general interior. I mean, Cadillac has made, I think, a step change in commitment. Now they were pushed into it. They had some tough competition, and I don't think they would be would have the prospect of gaining market share that they have today had they not made those changes. But I think they deserve the award. And the interesting thing about that, one of the criteria of being selected there is that you then have to go out and show what you have done in terms of total quality performance to all of your suppliers. And General Motors has a lot of suppliers around the country, so they're going to take their role models and their success stories back to their suppliers and ask their suppliers to sign up and be part of the process that they went through. And I think it's a very healthy thing. Yes, sir.
Okay. Supposing that the project is intended for catching up for some existing technology, or supposing that the purpose of the project is definitely fixed, a collaboration is very effective, I think. But supposing that the project is intended for making a new innovation, collaboration is not so efficient, I think. In Japan, collaboration used to be very efficient when the project is intended for making machines which have less energy consumption systems, or intended for making machines which reduce pollution. But we have to confess that it is not so efficient these days in Japan, including the fifth generation computer development. And in my opinion, I think now, rather than collaboration, the combination of promotion of competitiveness and tax reduction for investment is better, I think. And these phenomena, this situation may be applied to thematic projects, I think. And so my question is, what do you think about my opinion? Yeah.
Well, I think your opinion is right, but let me give you a couple of concerns I have about it. I agree. I think the VLSI experiment in Japan will go down in history as an example of how government and industry can work together to bring a nation into preeminent position in a key technology. That was superbly done, and we should study that a lot more. I understand one of our people here is writing a book about that, and we'll hear a lot more about that experiment. I also agree with you that the fifth generation project was not so successful. However, I'm very worried about the sixth generation computer project. I think the Japanese learn very well from their experiments. The project that occurred just before the VLSI experiment, and I've forgotten what it was called, was not very successful either. I think your country is better at learning from the experiments it runs in cooperation than the United States or Europe is at this time.
But these phenomena also applies in the United States. I think sometimes collaboration dispels competitiveness, and so it prevents innovation. How do you think about that?
Well, I'm not as certain as you are that's the case. I think the examples you give are accurate. The ones involving innovation with the 5th Gen project, when you were trying to make a gallium arsenide knowledge-based machine, was not successful. But it hasn't stopped a software project, which I can't remember the name of, and an attempt to look at a 6th Gen project as well. And as I say, I'm worried that the next one will learn from the mistakes in 5th Gen and be very successful.
Let me just add a comment. I think the most successful Japanese projects in which the government has encouraged a collaborative activity have been where there was a need for rapid development of some industrial infrastructure within which the highly competitive large companies could move rapidly and compete. Much of the VLSI program was in fact devoted to that kind of investment, to design automation, to lots of tooling, to the building of the second-tier companies. One of our doctoral students who just got his degree here at the Kennedy School in June wrote his dissertation on a study of Japanese government-led collaboration. And he concluded in his study that MIDI's role, that these were not pre-competitive collaboration projects. They were pro-competitive collaboration projects. That is, MIDI's role was primarily to respond to an initiative that came from industry that said here was a sector that needed attention and needed emphasis. And once the leading parties in industry had taken that view, MIDI's job was the enforcer. MIDI said, okay, we're going to do this, but we're going to make sure that all the right people participate so that everybody competes. And MIDI dragged additional competitors into the, quote, consortium, unquote, not to give away advantage to each other, but in fact to bring all of them up to a high-intensity level of competition. So the tool can be used in lots of ways, but I think Sematech is really aimed at that kind of infrastructure investment, not at the creation of a technology that doesn't exist.
Yes, sir.
I have two questions, one for Mr. Baker and one for Mr. Spencer. Mr. Baker, how would you justify...
I'm sorry, we really just have time for one more question. This gentleman over here has been waiting a long time. I want to take two more questions. Can you just pick one, please?
Sure. I just wanted to ask how it would be, how you could justify it's quite all right to entrust the private sector with critical projects, growing crystals in the space shuttle, et cetera. Will that work be carried on given the perennial charge that the private sector has a short-term focus and a profit incentive? And I'm from IBM. I'm on leave for a year. I think it was Lou who joked and asked me if I was on permanent leave. I'm hoping to go back next year. But
well, I think the unique contribution that the private sector can make in a cooperative area is a understanding of the market and the understanding of customer needs now and in the future. And you cannot develop technology in a vacuum. You have to point it towards some objective that you want to achieve. And the principal contribution that I think in a government-industry collaboration is to keep that focus on the end market that you're trying to satisfy, to make sure that the monies are being spent in a way that truly does add down the road value to the nation as a whole. And the challenge that I proposed earlier on is to take that $22 billion and some part of that and see if through a collaborative effort we can't refocus the national laboratories in cooperation with industry, pointing the way towards end markets to see if we can't take advantage of that national resource, but for commercially viable products and programs.
Last question.
This is a question for Dr. Spencer. I'm a member of the board of directors of the Campaign for Responsible Technology, which you're probably familiar with. And tomorrow, I believe there's going to be testimony in the Congress about Sematech, at which our chairman is going to be testifying. I believe you're scheduled to testify too. You know about the campaign. I should probably explain it to the audience.
Now, this really has to be a question, worthy as whatever this
Yeah,
is.
it'll be a question.
This is the end of the evening.
The campaign is a coalition of about 35 public interest, labor, and environmental organizations, which has lobbied the Congress for a $10 million earmarked R&D funding component to fiscal year 93 Cemetec's budget for environmental research and development. And at the hearing tomorrow in the Congress, there are two other demands. One is community and labor representation on the Cemetec Advisory Board, and the third is change of the Cemetec charter to permit the release of information under right to know laws. And I'm curious about what is going to be your response in the Congress tomorrow when they ask you questions about those three demands. And in general, I would like to ask you and the other speaker, if we are going to have a technology policy, how do we make sure that it's democratic, that it includes these kinds of constituencies from labor, public interest organizations, environmental organizations, and other constituencies, and not just be directed by technologists and elite government bureaucrats?
If you're willing to disclose your view on that before the Congress, go ahead.
Well, I think we owe the CRT a vote of thanks for the help that we got from them in raising the Cemetec budget this year from $80 million, which is what the Defense Department submitted to Congress in January, to the $100 million which the House Armed Services Committee and the House Appropriations Committee approved, and as a separate line item. And as the gentleman pointed out, with $10 million earmarked for environmental research and development or technology to improve the environment through in semiconductor manufacturing processes. I hope that we won't be limited to $10 million in the amount of money we can spend on environment. We believe if you look at the amount of money that's been spent on things like acid reprocessing and gas scrubbing and the whole plasma processing, where we're eliminating liquids and going to processes that are easier to scrub, it's using the air that Dexter talked about earlier. We think the amount of money we spend in that area is higher, and I'd be glad to go over those with you as much as I can remember them. With regard to the other items, the Freedom of Information Act, the only information that's kept private within Cemetec at the present time is that's considered proprietary to our customers. Member companies provide us with information which we're not privileged to share because of the contractual agreement we have with them. The technology which is developed at Cemetec belongs to all of the member companies, and it would be up to the board of directors, of which the government has representation, to decide what they want to do with that information. I think that it's not being kept from wide distribution, not because we believe we've done something illegal. I think GAO has looked at us half a dozen times in the past 3 years and has said we've followed all the procedures that we should have. But that information, we think, is important to the competitive position of our member companies. So those changes I can't make as from a Cemetec standpoint. It has to be made by our board, and I think that's under active discussion with people from your organization.
Well, let me close this evening by once again welcoming the new students to the Kennedy School, thanking all the participants in today's seminar, our convener, Lou Branscombe, and above all, our speakers, Dexter Baker and Bill Spencer. This issue isn't going to go away, whoever is elected in November, and I think we can anticipate many more forum events on the same subject. Thanks very much to our two speakers and to you, Lou.